The Khyber Pass is not a single route, but a series of narrow defiles carved through 33 miles of limestone and shale, connecting the plains of Peshawar to the plateau of Jalalabad. The walls rise vertically in places to heights exceeding 600 feet, their surfaces scarred by centuries of weather and human transit. The pass has no single owner and never has. It belongs to the tribes who control the heights, the Afridis and the Shinwaris and the Mohmens, clans whose territories overlap and shift with marriages and feuds and the seasonal movement of livestock. They permit passage to those who pay tribute or demonstrate strength, and they close the route to those who show neither. The British learned this in 1839 when the Army of the Indus marched 16,000 men and 38,000 camp followers through the pass to install Shah Shuja on the throne in Kabul, and they learned it again in January of 1842 when fewer than a dozen of those 16,000 returned alive. The First Afghan War was a catastrophe by any measure. The British had entered Afghanistan with confidence born of imperial momentum, believing that the application of disciplined force and modern weaponry would secure the northern approaches to India against Russian expansion. They installed their puppet king, garrisoned Kabul with 4,000 troops, and settled into winter quarters while the mountain passes filled with snow. The Afghans, who had initially seemed compliant, withdrew into the hills and waited. In November of 1841, they rose. The British envoy, Sir William McNagden, was killed during negotiations, his body dragged through the streets. The garrison, besieged and running low on supplies, agreed to withdraw under promise of safe conduct. The promise was worthless. The column departed Kabul on January 6, 1842, in temperatures well below freezing, and was harried and ambushed continuously through the passes. By January 13th, when the remnants reached the approaches to Jalalabad, only one European remained. Assistant Surgeon William Bryden, who rode into the fort on a dying horse with multiple wounds and a story that would define British policy in the region for the next century. The disaster demanded response. In March of 1842, Major General George Pollock assembled a punitive expedition at Peshawar with orders to relieve the garrison at Jalalabad, retrieve British prisoners held by Afghan chiefs, and restore British prestige by demonstrating that withdrawal did not constitute defeat. The force consisted of approximately 8,000 troops, British regulars from the 9th and 31st Foot, Sepoy infantry from the Bengal Army, irregular cavalry from the Sikh states, and a train of artillery that included 9-pounder field guns and heavier siege pieces intended for the reduction of fortified positions. The column was massive, unwieldy, and entirely dependent on the single route through the Khyber Pass for its advance and eventual retreat. Pollock was a careful commander, methodical, and aware of the lessons written in blood just 2 months prior. He did not intend to repeat the mistakes of the Kabul garrison. Before advancing through the pass, he dispatched reconnaissance elements to scout the route, assess tribal disposition, and secure the high ground at key points where ambush was most likely. The reconnaissance was led by Captain James Abbott of the Bengal Artillery, an officer who had served on the frontier for 6 years and spoke passable Pashto. Abbott's orders were explicit: identify defensible positions, estimate enemy strength, and determine whether the pass could be held long enough for the main column to transit safely. Abbott departed Peshawar on March 12th with a detachment of 50 men, 20 British soldiers from the 31st Foot, 20 sepoys from the 27th Bengal Native Infantry, and 10 Sikh irregular cavalry serving as scouts and translators. They carried 7 days of rations, ammunition for sustained contact, and climbing equipment for accessing elevated observation points. The detachment moved cautiously, advancing no more than 5 miles per day, pausing frequently to glass the ridgelines with telescopes and probe side ravines for concealed positions. They encountered no resistance for the first 2 days. The pass was empty, almost unnaturally so. The villages that clung to the lower slopes were abandoned, their stone compounds silent and their fields untended. No shepherds moved on the hillsides. No caravans traveled the road. The only signs of recent habitation were cook fires that had been extinguished hastily, leaving coals still warm, and footprints in the dust that led upward into the heights and did not return. On the evening of March 14, Abbott's detachment reached a position approximately 16 miles into the pass, near a geographic feature the local guides referred to as Ko-i-Jadu, the Mountain of Sorcery. The name was not marked on British maps, which identified the location only by elevation and distance from Peshawar. The mountain was not the tallest in the range, but it was distinctive, a sharp pyramidal peak that rose abruptly from the southern wall of the pass, its summit crowned with what appeared to be ruins of some kind, structures too regular to be natural formations, but too eroded to be recent construction. Abbott questioned the guides about the name and the ruins. They were reluctant to speak. One, an older man named Yusuf, who had worked with British officers before, said that the mountain had been called Ko-i-Jadu for longer than anyone could remember, and that the people who had built the structures on the summit were not people in the sense that the British understood the term. He said they had been there before the Pathans, before the Mughals, before even the memory of the tribes extended, and that what remained of them should not be disturbed. Abbott asked what would happen if the structures were disturbed. Yusuf said that the mountain had a guardian, a presence that the locals called Jadugar, the witch. He said she appeared to those who climbed too high or stayed too long in the shadow of the peak, and that men who saw her did not return the same. Some came back silent and vacant, their minds emptied of memory and purpose. Others did not come back at all. Their bodies, when found, showed no wounds, no signs of struggle, only a stillness that suggested they had simply stopped living, as if some essential component had been extracted and they had been left as empty vessels. Yusuf said the British could march through the pass if they wished, but they should not camp near the mountain, and they should not send men to investigate the ruins, no matter how tactically advantageous the high ground appeared. Abbott thanked him for the information and dismissed it as superstition. The high ground was precisely what he needed. From the summit of Ko-i-Jadu, he could observe the entire length of the pass for miles in both directions, identify potential ambush sites, and relay intelligence back to General Pollock via signal flags. He selected a squad of 12 men, 8 British soldiers and 4 sepoys, and informed them they would ascend the mountain at first light on March 15th to establish an observation post. The men received the orders without comment, though several glanced toward Yusuf, who stood at the edge of the camp and said nothing, his expression unreadable in the firelight. That night, the temperature dropped sharply, far lower than it should have for mid-March at that elevation. Frost formed on the equipment and the ground, and the sentries reported that the wind had shifted, coming down from the summit of Ko-i-Jadu rather than along the axis of the pass. The wind carried a smell, faint but distinct, like incense mixed with something metallic, almost like blood. One of the sentries, a private named William Harker, reported seeing movement on the upper slopes of the mountain, a figure or figures silhouetted briefly against the stars before disappearing behind an outcrop. He could not say how many or whether they were human. Abbott doubled the guard and ordered the men to remain alert, but no further movement was observed. At 05:30 hours on March 15th, as the first gray light began to define the eastern ridgeline, Abbott assembled the climbing party and issued final instructions. They would ascend via the southern approach, moving slowly and securing each section before advancing. Communication would be by whistle signal. If they encountered hostile forces, they were to withdraw immediately and rejoin the main detachment. The ascent was estimated to take 4 to 5 hours. By midday, they should be in position. The party departed at 0600 hours and began the climb. Abbott watched them through his telescope as they moved upward, small dark shapes against the pale stone, shrinking steadily as they gained altitude. By 0800 hours, they had reached approximately half the distance to the summit and were no longer visible from the camp, obscured by the angle of the slope and the intervening rock formations. Abbott lowered the telescope and returned to the maps, calculating sight lines and fields of fire, preparing his report for General Pollock. He did not look up again until noon, when the first whistle signal was supposed to sound, marking the party's arrival at the summit. No signal came. By 1300 hours, Abbott was concerned. By 1400, he was preparing a relief party. And by 1500, when the sun began its descent toward the western peaks and the shadow of Kohe Jadu stretched across the camp like a blade, he saw them returning. Not all of them, only 7. They descended in silence, moving mechanically. And when they reached the camp and Abbott demanded an explanation, none of them spoke. They stood in formation, staring ahead with expressions that were not quite blank, but not quite present, as if they were looking at something beyond the visible world. Their uniforms were intact, their weapons accounted for, and there was no blood, no sign of injury or conflict. But something had been taken from them. Abbott could see it in their eyes. And when he turned to look back at the mountain, the ruins on the summit seemed darker than they had before, as if the stone itself had absorbed light and was now radiating shadow instead. Abbott conducted the debriefing in his tent, away from the rest of the detachment. He interviewed each of the 7 returned men individually, beginning with Sergeant Thomas Wickham, a veteran of 12 years' service who had fought in the Sikh Wars and had a reputation for steadiness under fire. Wickham sat on a camp stool with his hands resting on his knees, his posture correct, but his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond Abbott's shoulder. When Abbott asked what had happened on the mountain, Wickham did not respond immediately. The silence stretched for nearly a minute before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was flat, stripped of inflection. He said they had reached the summit at 1100 hours. The ruins were more extensive than they had appeared from below, not a single structure, but a complex of them, arranged in concentric circles around a central plaza or courtyard that had been carved directly into the bedrock. The architecture was unlike anything Wickham had seen in India or Afghanistan. The stones fitted together without mortar in patterns that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. Some surfaces were covered with inscriptions, symbols that resembled no known script, geometric and flowing simultaneously, as if the language itself could not decide what form it should take. The air at the summit had been wrong, Wickham said. Too still, despite the wind that buffeted the lower slopes. Too warm, despite the elevation and the season. And there had been a sound, constant but nearly subliminal, like the hum of 1,000 insects or the vibration of a distant machine, coming from beneath the stones or from the stones themselves. Private Harker, the same man who had reported movement the previous night, had said it sounded like breathing. Wickham had told him to be silent and focus on establishing the observation post. They had spread out to survey the ruins and identify the best vantage points. Wickham and 3 others had moved to the northern edge of the summit, where the drop into the pass was sheer and the view extended for miles. The remaining 8 had stayed near the central plaza to examine the inscriptions and determine if the structures could provide shelter for an extended observation mission. That was when they heard the scream. It came from the direction of the plaza, a single prolonged cry that cut off abruptly, as if severed mid-breath. Wickham and his group had rushed back, weapons ready, expecting to find evidence of an ambush or a fall. Instead, they found 5 men standing motionless in a semicircle around the plaza, staring at something in the center. The remaining 3 were gone. Wickham had called out, demanding to know what had happened. None of the 5 men responded. They continued to stare, unblinking, their expressions serene in a way that made Wickham's skin crawl. He had approached cautiously, moving to a position where he could see what they were looking at. In the center of the plaza was a fissure, a crack in the bedrock perhaps 2 meters long and half a meter wide, radiating a faint luminescence that was neither firelight nor daylight, but something in between. The air above the fissure distorted, shimmering like heat haze, and from within the crack came that sound, the breathing sound, louder now and unmistakably rhythmic. Wickham said he had the overwhelming impression that something was inside the fissure, something large and aware, and that it was watching them through the crack as if through a partially open door. One of the 5 motionless men had stepped forward then, moving without command or apparent volition, and knelt beside the fissure. Before Wickham could react, the man had leaned forward and placed his hand into the crack. There was no resistance, no recoil. The stone did not cut him. His arm simply disappeared into the fissure up to the elbow, as if he had thrust it into water. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the man began to scream, not in pain but in something worse, a sound of absolute terror mixed with confusion, as if he could not understand what was happening to him, but knew it was irreversible. Wickham had grabbed the man and pulled, trying to extract his arm from the fissure. It came free immediately, too easily, and when Wickham saw what emerged, he had stepped back and nearly fallen. The arm was intact, structurally. The bones, the muscles, the skin, all present, but it was empty, hollow. The man continued to scream, staring at his own limb as if it belonged to someone else, and then he had collapsed, unconscious or dead. Wickham could not tell which. The remaining 4 men had not moved. They continued to stare at the fissure, their faces illuminated by that strange light, and Wickham realized with sick certainty that they were waiting their turn. He had shouted orders, tried to snap them out of whatever trance held them, but they did not respond. He made the decision then to withdraw with the 3 men under his direct command, leaving the others behind. It was cowardice, he said, or pragmatism, or survival instinct. He did not know which and did not care to determine the distinction. They had descended as quickly as the terrain allowed, and when they reached the halfway point and looked back, they saw figures moving on the summit. Not the men they had left behind, but something else, shapes that moved with the wrong articulation, limbs bending at joints that should not have existed. Abbott asked what had happened to the man who had put his arm into the fissure. Wickham said they had left him at the summit. He had not been breathing when they departed. Abbott asked if Wickham had seen the witch, the Jadugar that the guides had warned about. Wickham said he had seen no witch, only the fissure and the light and the shapes moving in the ruins. But he said that if the witch existed, she was not a woman and not a spirit in any sense he understood. She was something older, something that lived beneath the mountain or within it, and the ruins were not structures, but a doorway, a threshold that had been sealed long ago and was now opening again. Abbott interviewed the other 6 men. Their accounts varied in minor details, but corroborated the essential sequence of events. All reported the fissure, the light, the man with the hollow arm. None could explain why the 5 men had remained motionless, or why they themselves had been able to retreat when others could not. When Abbott asked if they would return to the summit to retrieve the bodies of their comrades, all 6 refused. It was the first time in Abbott's career that British soldiers had openly declined a direct order, and he did not press the issue. He could see in their faces that whatever authority he possessed as an officer had been superseded by something they had witnessed on the mountain, something that rendered rank and discipline irrelevant. At 1800 hours, Abbott sent a dispatch rider back to Peshawar with a preliminary report for General Pollock. The message was concise: reconnaissance delayed due to hostile terrain and possible enemy presence. Request permission to bypass Ko-e-Jadu and continue advance through alternate route. Expected delay, 48 hours. He did not mention the ruins, the fissure, or the missing men. He knew that any explanation involving phenomena outside the parameters of conventional warfare would be dismissed as heat exhaustion or native superstition, and that such a report would damage his credibility and potentially his career. The reply arrived at 2100 hours, carried by the same rider who had made the return journey in record time. General Pollock's orders were unambiguous: secure the high ground at Ko-i-Jadu as planned. The main column would begin transit through the pass in 72 hours and required accurate intelligence on enemy dispositions. Alternate routes were not feasible due to supply constraints and time pressure. Abbott was instructed to complete the reconnaissance mission and report findings no later than March 17th. The message concluded with a reminder that the success of the expedition and the security of British India depended on officers executing their duties with resolve and without unnecessary delay. Abbott read the orders twice, then called for Yusuf, the guide. The old man arrived within minutes, as if he had been waiting to be summoned. Abbott asked him directly, what was in the ruins on the summit, and how could it be neutralized or avoided? Yusuf said that the ruins contained nothing and everything. He said the mountain was a boundary place, a location where the world of the living intersected with something else, something that the ancestors had known about and had tried to seal. The witch was the guardian of that boundary, the intelligence that ensured the seal remained intact. But seals weakened over time, especially when disturbed by those who did not understand what they were protecting. The British, by sending men to the summit, had cracked the seal. Now the boundary was open, and the witch would do what she had always done. She would take what was offered and give nothing in return. Abbott asked if there was a way to close the boundary to reseal the fissure. Yusuf said there was, but it required a willing offering, a life given freely rather than taken by force. The ancestors had done this, he said, sending one of their own into the fissure to maintain the seal for another generation. But the British did not have generations. They had days. And Abbott, Yusuf observed, did not have volunteers. Abbott dismissed the guide and sat alone in his tent, staring at the map of the pass and the elevation drawings of Ko-i-Jadu. He had 72 hours to secure the high ground, and he had already lost 5 men, possibly more, to something he could neither fight nor comprehend. He could refuse the orders, withdraw the detachment, and face court-martial for cowardice and dereliction. Or he could find another way to complete the mission, a way that did not require sending more men into the ruins. At 2200 hours, he made his decision. He would return to the summit himself, accompanied by a minimal force, and determine whether the fissure could be destroyed by conventional means, explosives, artillery fire, or engineering work. If the boundary could be collapsed, sealed with stone and earth, then the threat would be neutralized without further loss. It was a gamble, but it was the only option that allowed him to fulfill his orders without sacrificing his men to an enemy he could not see or understand. He assembled a volunteer party, 6 men, including Sergeant Wickham, who agreed to return despite his earlier refusal, and 2 sepoy engineers from the Bengal sappers and miners who carried blasting powder and fuses. They would depart at first light on March 16th and reach the summit by midday. The mission parameters were simple: assess the fissure, determine if it could be destroyed, and execute demolition if feasible. If the situation proved untenable, they would withdraw immediately, and Abbott would personally deliver the report to General Pollock, recommending that the pass be closed to British forces until the phenomenon subsided or could be addressed by specialists. The men prepared their equipment in silence, checking powder charges and fuses, sharpening bayonets, and writing brief letters to be delivered in the event they did not return. Abbott did not write a letter. He sat in his tent and reviewed his service record, mentally cataloging the campaigns and postings and commendations that had brought him to this point, and wondered whether any of it had prepared him for what waited on the mountain. He concluded that it had not, but that preparation was irrelevant. Duty was not a question of readiness, but of commitment, and he had committed himself the moment he had accepted the reconnaissance orders. At 0400 hours, unable to sleep, Abbott stepped outside and looked up at Ko-i-Jadu. The summit was dark, invisible against the night sky, but he could feel it, a weight pressing down on the camp, a presence that was aware and patient. Somewhere in the ruins, the fissure was open, and the witch was waiting. The party departed at first light, moving in single file up the southern approach. Abbott led, followed by Sergeant Wickham, the two sepoy engineers, Havildar Ram Singh and Naik Gopal Das, and two British privates carrying additional powder charges and climbing rope. The sky was clear, the air cold but not bitter, and the wind had died completely during the night, leaving a stillness that made every sound carry with unnatural clarity. The scrape of boot on stone, the clink of equipment, the rhythmic breathing of men under exertion, all of it seemed amplified, as if the mountain itself were listening. They climbed without speaking, conserving energy and maintaining focus on the route. The path was not marked, but was evident from use, a series of natural shelves and ledges that switchbacked upward through sections of loose scree and solid rock. In places, the passage narrowed to less than a meter, forcing them to proceed one at a time with their backs pressed against the cliff face. Abbott noted evidence of recent transit, disturbed stones, scuff marks in the dust, and in one location, a length of rope anchored to an outcrop that had not been there when the first party ascended. He did not know who had placed it, and he did not stop to investigate. At 0700 hours, they reached a natural platform approximately 2/3 of the way to the summit, a shelf of stone wide enough to accommodate the entire party. Abbott called a halt to check the men's condition and redistribute the load. Wickham reported that all were fit to continue, though one of the privates, a young man named Edward Pierce, was showing signs of altitude stress. Rapid breathing, slight disorientation. Abbott ordered him to rest for 10 minutes and drink from his canteen. While the men caught their breath, Abbott scanned the upper slopes with his telescope, searching for movement or any indication of what awaited them at the summit. The ruins were visible from this elevation, more distinct than they had been from the base camp. He could see the concentric circles Wickham had described, the arrangement of structures radiating outward from a central point like ripples frozen in stone. The architecture was unsettling even at this distance, the angles somehow wrong, the proportions inconsistent with human scale or purpose. Abbott had studied classical architecture during his education, had seen Roman and Greek ruins, Mughal monuments, and the fortifications of a dozen conquered peoples. None of them resembled what he saw now. These structures predated anything in his frame of reference, or perhaps they had never been intended for human occupation at all. As he lowered the telescope, Havildar Ram Singh approached and asked permission to speak. Abbott granted it. Ram Singh said that he had grown up in the Punjab, near the Salt Range, and that his grandfather had been a stonemason who worked on the restoration of old temples and shrines. The grandfather had told him stories about places like this, high places where the earth was thin and the things beneath could push through if the barriers were weakened. He called them Pataldwar, gates to the underworld, though he had said the underworld was not a place of punishment, but simply another layer of reality, one that existed alongside the world of the living and occasionally intersected with it at specific geographic points. Abbott asked if the grandfather had said how such gates could be closed. Ram Singh said yes, but the methods were old, older than Islam or Hinduism, drawn from traditions that had existed before either religion had taken root in the region. The most reliable method was blood, he said. Not sacrifice in the ritualistic sense, but offering. A life given to the gate in exchange for its sealing, a transaction that balanced the opening with an equivalent closing. Abbott asked if explosives would work. Ram Singh said he did not know, but he doubted it. Stone could be broken, but the gate was not made of stone. It was made of boundary, of the threshold between one state and another, and thresholds could not be destroyed, only locked or unlocked. Abbott thanked him for the information and ordered the party to resume the climb. He did not dismiss what Ram Singh had said, but he also did not see an alternative. He had brought explosives because explosives were what he had, and he would use them because he was a British officer trained in engineering and warfare, not in metaphysics or ancient boundary rituals. If the fissure could be collapsed, he would collapse it. If it could not, he would report that fact to General Pollock and let higher authority determine the next course of action. They reached the summit at 0945 hours. The transition from the exposed slope to the level ground of the ruins was abrupt, marked by a low wall of fitted stones that formed a perimeter around the entire complex. Abbott ordered the men to spread out and secure the area, establishing a defensive position before they approached the central plaza. Wickham took 2 men and moved to the northern edge to establish observation of the pass below. Ram Singh and Gopal Das unpacked the blasting charges and began preparing fuses, working methodically despite the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to thicken the closer they came to the center of the ruins. Abbott advanced alone toward the plaza, his rifle held at the ready, eyes scanning for movement or signs of the 5 men who had been left behind. He found the first body near the entrance to the plaza, partially concealed behind a collapsed section of wall. It was Private Harker, the man who had reported seeing movement on the mountain 2 nights prior. He lay on his back, arms at his sides, eyes open and staring at the sky. There were no wounds, no blood, no indication of trauma. His skin was pale, waxy, and when Abbott touched his hand to check for warmth, the flesh was cold but not stiff, as if the body had been drained of heat without passing through the usual stages of decomposition. Abbott moved on, stepping carefully over the threshold into the plaza. The space was exactly as Wickham had described, a circular courtyard carved into the bedrock, approximately 30 meters in diameter, surrounded by the concentric rings of structures. The inscriptions covered every surface, flowing in continuous bands that spiraled inward toward the center. Abbott could not read them, could not even determine if they were meant to be read or if they served some other function. But he felt a pressure behind his eyes as he looked at them, a sensation of meaning just beyond comprehension, like trying to recall a word that hovered on the edge of memory. In the center of the plaza was the fissure. It was wider than Wickham had reported, nearly a meter across now, and the light emanating from within was brighter, pulsing in slow, rhythmic waves that matched the breathing sound Abbott could now hear clearly. The air above the crack shimmered and distorted, and looking into it made Abbott's vision swim, his depth perception collapse as if the fissure extended both downward into the earth and outward in directions that had no physical correlation. The remaining 4 bodies were arranged around the fissure in a semicircle, seated cross-legged with their hands resting on their knees. Their eyes were closed, their expressions peaceful, and they appeared to be breathing, though Abbott could see no rise and fall of their chests. He called out to them, identifying himself and ordering them to respond. None moved. He approached the nearest one, a sepoy named Ranjit Singh, and placed a hand on his shoulder. The man's eyes opened immediately, but they were wrong. The irises were gone, replaced by a uniform milky whiteness that reflected the light from the fissure. Ranjit Singh turned his head slowly toward Abbott and smiled, an expression of serene contentment that was more disturbing than any scream could have been. Then he spoke, but the voice was not his own. It was layered, multiple tones overlapping, and it spoke in a language Abbott did not recognize, though he understood the meaning as if the words bypassed his ears entirely and imprinted themselves directly onto his consciousness. The voice said, "The threshold opens. The gift is received. The balance will be restored." Abbott stumbled back, his hand going to his sidearm instinctively. He shouted for Ram Singh and the engineers, ordering them to bring the charges forward immediately. As he called out, the ground beneath the plaza began to vibrate, a low-frequency tremor that he felt in his bones more than heard with his ears. The light from the fissure intensified, and the breathing sound grew louder, faster, as if whatever lay beneath were awakening, rising toward the surface. Ram Singh and Gopal Das arrived with the powder charges, moving quickly but carefully. Abbott pointed to the fissure and ordered them to place the charges around its perimeter and prepare for immediate detonation. The engineers complied, working with practiced efficiency despite the chaos of sensation, the vibration, the light, the wrongness of the air itself. They arranged 8 charges in a circular pattern, each one packed with enough black powder to shatter stone and collapse tunnels. The fuses were cut short, no more than 60 seconds burn time, to ensure the party could retreat to a safe distance before the blast. As they worked, the 4 seated figures around the fissure began to stand, moving in perfect unison as if controlled by a single will. They did not advance or threaten, but simply stood and faced outward, their milk-white eyes fixed on Abbott and his men. Wickham returned from the northern observation point at a run, reporting that shapes were visible in the outer rings of ruins, multiple figures moving through the structures, converging slowly on the plaza. He estimated at least a dozen, though their movements were irregular, stopping and starting without apparent cause, and he could not determine if they were human or something else. Abbott made the decision. He ordered Ram Singh to light the fuses immediately. The Havildar struck a match, touched it to the first fuse, and began moving rapidly around the circle, igniting each charge in sequence. The fuses sparked and hissed, burning down toward the powder with agonizing slowness. Abbott counted in his head, 60 seconds, 55, 50, and ordered the party to withdraw to the perimeter wall. They moved as a group toward the low stone barrier, weapons trained on the shapes that were now clearly visible. Tall, elongated figures that moved with articulation suggesting too many joints, their outlines blurred as if seen through thick glass or heat haze. The figures did not rush, but advanced steadily, deliberately, herding Abbott's party back toward the edge of the summit. At 40 seconds remaining, Abbott looked back at the plaza. The 4 possessed men still stood in their semicircle, unmoving, unbothered by the burning fuses at their feet. And beyond them, at the far edge of the plaza, a new figure had appeared. It was impossibly tall, perhaps 3 meters, draped in material that shifted between fabric and something organic, gray and membranous. It had no face, only a smooth oval surface where features should have been, but Abbott felt its attention on him with absolute certainty, a regard that was neither hostile nor benign, but utterly indifferent. The witch had arrived, and she was watching. The charges detonated at 32 seconds, earlier than planned, as if triggered by something other than the burning fuses. The blast was enormous, a percussion wave that threw Abbott and his men to the ground and sent fragments of stone arcing through the air in every direction. The sound rolled across the pass like thunder, echoing from wall to wall, and for several seconds the summit was obscured entirely by smoke and pulverized rock. Abbott's ears rang, his vision swam, and he tasted blood where he had bitten his tongue during the fall. He pushed himself to his knees, fumbling for his rifle, and looked toward the plaza through the clearing smoke. The explosives had functioned as designed. The stone around the fissure was shattered, reduced to rubble and scattered across the courtyard. Entire sections of the carved floor had been blown apart, and the concentric rings of structures nearest the blast were damaged, their walls cracked and partially collapsed. But the fissure itself remained. Not only remained, but had grown, expanding from a meter wide to nearly 2 meters, and the light emanating from within was no longer pulsing, but steady, brilliant, painful to look at directly. The witch had not moved. She stood in the exact same position beyond the fissure, untouched by the blast, as if the explosion had occurred in a different dimension and left her unaffected. The 4 possessed men lay where they had fallen, their bodies broken by the concussion, but their eyes remained open and white, still reflecting that terrible light. Abbott called for his men to regroup. Wickham was on his feet, bleeding from a cut above his eye, but otherwise functional. Ram Singh and Gopal Das were both conscious, though the Havildar's left arm hung at an awkward angle, likely dislocated or fractured. Private Pierce was unconscious, a section of stone having struck him in the chest, and the other private, a man named Collins, was attempting to revive him. Abbott ordered them to fall back to the perimeter wall and prepare to descend immediately. Whatever they had attempted had failed. The boundary could not be destroyed by conventional means. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to withdraw, the elongated figures that had been converging on the plaza emerged fully from the outer ruins. There were more than Wickham had estimated, at least 20, moving with that same disturbing articulation, limbs bending at impossible angles. They formed a loose semicircle around Abbott's position, not attacking, but blocking the route back down the mountain. They stood motionless, eyeless faces turned toward the British party, waiting. Wickham raised his rifle and fired at the nearest figure. The ball struck center mass and passed through without effect, leaving a hole that did not bleed or collapse. The figure did not react. Wickham reloaded and fired again, this time aiming for the head. The result was identical. The sergeant lowered his weapon and looked at Abbott, his expression asking the question he did not voice. What orders could possibly apply to enemies that could not be killed? Abbott had no answer. He turned his attention back to the witch, the only entity present that seemed to possess intelligence rather than mere function. She had not moved, had not threatened, had simply observed. He made a decision born of desperation and the faint hope that something capable of thought might also be capable of negotiation. He stepped forward, away from his men, and addressed her directly in English, knowing she would not understand the words, but hoping the tone and gesture would convey intent. He said he understood that a boundary had been violated, that his men had disturbed something that should have remained sealed. He said he took responsibility for that violation and was willing to offer recompense if she would permit his surviving men safe passage from the mountain. He did not know what form that recompense should take, but he was prepared to discuss terms. The witch tilted her head, a gesture that might have indicated curiosity or incomprehension. For several seconds, nothing changed. Then she moved, gliding forward across the shattered plaza without apparent effort, her form passing over the rubble without touching it. She approached to within 5 meters of Abbott and stopped. Up close, she was even more unsettling than at distance. The material draped across her form moved independently, rippling and shifting as if alive, and where it parted, Abbott could see that beneath it there was nothing, no body, no substance, only a deeper darkness that seemed to extend inward infinitely. She raised one elongated hand and pointed not at Abbott, but past him, toward his men, specifically toward Private Pierce, who lay unconscious on the ground. The gesture was unmistakable. She wanted the unconscious man. Abbott's first instinct was refusal, but he forced himself to consider the pragmatics. Pierce was badly injured, possibly dying, and carrying him down the mountain would slow their escape and risk the entire party. If offering him to the witch would secure safe passage for the others, it was a transaction that military necessity might justify. But even as the thought formed, Abbott rejected it. He was an officer of the British Army, and the army did not abandon its wounded to appease incomprehensible entities, no matter how tactically expedient. He shook his head and said no, the man was under his protection and would remain so. He offered himself instead, repeating his earlier proposition, his life in exchange for safe passage for his men. The witch lowered her hand. She made a sound the first Abbott had heard from her, a low harmonic tone that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity. The elongated figures around the perimeter moved closer, tightening the circle, and Abbott realized with cold clarity that negotiation had failed. She had made an offer, he had refused, and now she would simply take what she wanted. He drew his pistol and his saber, knowing both were useless but unable to stand passive while his men were taken. Wickham and the others formed up beside him, weapons ready, their faces set with the grim determination of men who understood they were about to die but would at least die fighting. It was a meaningless gesture, a pantomime of resistance against an enemy that could not be harmed, but it was all they had. The witch raised both hands. The light from the fissure intensified, became blinding, and the breathing sound grew to a roar. The ground beneath the plaza cracked, new fissures radiating outward from the central opening, and from those cracks emerged more of the elongated figures, dozens of them, pulling themselves up from whatever lay beneath. They moved toward Abbott's position with coordinated purpose, and he knew they had seconds before being overwhelmed. Then from somewhere behind the British position, a voice called out in Pashto, clear and commanding. It was Yusuf, the guide, who had somehow followed them up the mountain without being detected. He walked past Abbott and his men, moving directly toward the witch with his hands raised in supplication, not surrender. He called out again, this time in a language Abbott did not recognize, older than Pashto, the syllables harsh and rhythmic. The witch stopped. The elongated figures halted their advance. Yusuf continued speaking, his voice rising and falling in a cadence that suggested ritual or prayer. Abbott could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Offering, exchange, willing sacrifice. Yusuf was bargaining with the witch, and whatever he offered, she was listening. The old guide walked forward until he stood at the edge of the expanded fissure. The light washed over him, rendering him nearly translucent, and Abbott could see through his form to the structures beyond. Yusuf looked back once, his eyes meeting Abbott's, and in that moment, Abbott understood what was about to happen and knew he could not stop it. The old man turned back to the fissure and spoke a single word, its meaning clear, even without translation. Kabul. Accepted. Yusuf stepped forward into the fissure. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt. He simply walked into the light as if entering a doorway, and his form dissolved, becoming first translucent, then transparent, then gone. The fissure pulsed once, brilliantly, and then began to contract. The edges pulled inward, the light dimming, the breathing sound fading to a whisper. Within 30 seconds, the opening had closed completely, leaving only smooth bedrock marked with a faint circular scar where the crack had been. The witch remained for a moment longer. She turned her featureless face toward Abbott, and he felt her regard, a weight that seemed to measure and assess. Then she raised one hand in a gesture that might have been acknowledgement or dismissal, and her form began to fade, becoming transparent, then invisible, as if she had never been there at all. The elongated figures collapsed simultaneously, their forms dissolving into ash that scattered in a wind that had not been present moments before. The plaza was silent. The ruins were empty. The only sounds were the wind and the ragged breathing of Abbott and his surviving men. Private Pierce groaned and opened his eyes, returning to consciousness with no memory of what had transpired. The fissure was sealed, the boundary closed, and the price had been paid by a man who owed nothing to the British Empire but had given everything to prevent further tragedy. Abbott stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the place where Yusuf had disappeared. Then he gave the order to withdraw. They gathered their equipment, helped Pierce to his feet, and began the descent from the mountain. None of them spoke. There was nothing to say that would adequately address what they had witnessed, and silence seemed more honest than any attempt at explanation or justification. The descent took longer than the ascent. Pierce was mobile but weakened, requiring assistance over the more difficult sections, and Ram Singh's injured arm made climbing treacherous. They moved in silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts, processing what they had witnessed in the only way available, by not processing it at all, by focusing instead on the immediate physical tasks of navigation and survival. Abbott led, checking the route repeatedly, ensuring no man was left behind or allowed to fall. At 1300 hours, they reached the natural platform where they had rested during the ascent. Abbott called a halt to redistribute weight and check injuries. Pierce's breathing had stabilized, though his chest showed severe bruising where the stone had struck. Ram Singh's arm was definitely broken, the bone displaced but not protruding, and Gopal Das fashioned a rough splint using climbing rope and a section of rifle stock. The Havildar accepted the treatment without complaint, his face set in stoic endurance. While the engineers worked, Wickham approached Abbott and asked quietly if they would report what had actually occurred on the summit. Abbott considered the question carefully. He said they would report that reconnaissance was completed, that the high ground at Ko-e-Jadu was secured, and enemy presence in the immediate area was minimal. They would report casualties. 5 men lost during initial reconnaissance, presumed killed by tribal ambush, and the guide Yusuf killed during the return descent, cause of death to be determined. They would not report the ruins, the fissure, the witch, or the nature of what had sealed the boundary. Wickham asked why. Abbott said because no report that included those elements would be believed, and any officer who submitted such a report would be relieved of command for medical reasons, likely mental instability or opium addiction. The men who had witnessed the events would be interrogated separately. Their accounts would diverge in small details, as all eyewitness accounts do, and the inconsistencies would be used to discredit the entire narrative. The result would be career destruction for Abbott, possible criminal charges for the men involved, and no change to the strategic situation because General Pollock would send another reconnaissance party to Ko-e-Jadu regardless, and that party would experience the same phenomena or worse. The alternative, Abbott said, was to file a conventional report, ensure the high ground was marked as secure, and allow the main column to transit the pass without incident. The boundary was sealed, the witch was dormant or satisfied, and the ruins posed no threat as long as they were not disturbed again. It was not honest, but it was pragmatic, and in the calculus of military operations, pragmatism often outweighed truth. Wickham accepted the explanation without argument. He understood the logic, even if he did not entirely agree with it. He asked what they should tell the other men, those who had not been present during the final confrontation. Abbott said they would tell them the same story that would appear in the official report. Reconnaissance completed. Casualties from tribal action. Mission successful. The men who had been on the summit would understand that the story was incomplete, but they would also understand why, and soldiers were accustomed to living with incomplete information. They resumed the descent at 1330 hours and reached the base camp at 1500 hours. The detachment had remained in position, maintaining defensive perimeter and awaiting Abbott's return. When they saw the party approaching with wounded and reduced numbers, they prepared to receive casualties and began heating water for treatment. Abbott immediately sought out the senior NCO, a color sergeant named William Blackwood, and briefed him on the official narrative. Reconnaissance completed. 5 men lost during initial patrol to tribal ambush. Guide killed during descent from rockfall. Remaining objectives achieved. Blackwood listened without interruption, his expression neutral, and when Abbott finished, he asked a single question. Was the route safe for the main column? Abbott said yes, with the caveat that no further reconnaissance of the summit ruins should be attempted and that all troops should be instructed to avoid the upper elevations of Ko-e-Jadu entirely. The high ground provided adequate observation from the northern ridge without requiring access to the summit itself. Blackwood acknowledged and said he would ensure the restrictions were communicated to all squad leaders. At 1600 hours, Abbott composed his formal report to General Pollock. He wrote in clear, factual prose, documenting the reconnaissance timeline, the disposition of enemy forces in the pass, the terrain features relevant to the column's advance, and the recommendation that Ko-e-Jadu be utilized for observation but not occupation. He noted casualties and commended the men for their performance under difficult conditions. He made no mention of phenomena beyond the parameters of conventional military operations. When he finished, he read the report twice, sealed it, and dispatched a rider to Peshawar with instructions for immediate delivery. The camp settled into evening routine. Fires were lit, rations distributed, and the wounded treated with what medical supplies were available. Pierce was placed on light duty pending fuller recovery, and Ram Singh was marked for evacuation to the rear area hospital in Peshawar once the main column arrived. The men who had been present on the summit during the final confrontation did not speak about what they had seen, and the others, sensing that questions would not be welcome, did not ask. At 1800 hours, as the sun descended behind the western peaks and the temperature began its nightly fall, Abbott walked to the edge of the camp and looked up at Khoi Jadu. The summit was dark against the dimming sky, the ruins invisible from this angle, and nothing moved on the slopes. It appeared ordinary, unremarkable, simply another mountain in a range of mountains. But Abbott knew what lay at its peak, knew what had been sealed there and what price had been paid to seal it, and he wondered how long the seal would hold. Yusuf had said the ancestors performed the ritual every generation, sending one of their own into the boundary to maintain the closure. But the British had no generations here. They were transients, passing through on their way to somewhere else, and when they departed, the pass would return to tribal control, and the mountain would return to whatever equilibrium it had maintained for centuries. Perhaps the tribes would resume the old practices, would send their own offerings when necessary, or perhaps the boundary would simply remain closed, the witch dormant, the threshold locked until some future disturbance cracked it open again. Abbott did not know, and realized with some relief that it was not his responsibility to know. He had completed his mission, secured the route for the main column, and minimized casualties given the circumstances. What happened to Khoi Jadu after the British withdrew was a question for the tribes and their descendants, not for officers of the East India Company. At 1900 hours, a messenger arrived from the direction of Peshawar, riding hard and arriving in the camp with his horse lathered and blown. He carried dispatches from General Pollock. The main column would depart Peshawar on March 18th and expected to reach Abbott's position by March 20th. Abbott was to maintain current position, continue reconnaissance of the forward route, and prepare detailed briefings on terrain and enemy disposition for delivery upon the general's arrival. Abbott acknowledged the orders and dismissed the messenger. 2 days until the column arrived. 2 days to maintain the fiction that everything was normal and the reconnaissance had proceeded according to standard protocols. He could manage 2 days. He had managed far worse. That night, Abbott did not sleep. He lay in his tent listening to the sounds of the camp, the low voices of sentries, the crackle of fires, the wind moving through the pass. And beneath it all, so faint he might have imagined it, he thought he heard breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from the direction of the mountain. He told himself it was the wind, or his own pulse, or the residual effect of exhaustion and stress. But he did not believe it. The mountain was watching. The witch was waiting. And the boundary, though sealed, was not gone. It was simply closed, a door that had been locked but not removed, and doors could always be opened again if the right person applied the right pressure at the right time. Abbott hoped that person would not be British and that the time would not be soon, but he suspected, with the deep certainty of a man who had looked into something vast and alien and felt its regard upon him, that neither hope would prove correct. The empire was expanding, the frontier was contracting, and sooner or later someone would return to Khoi Jadu and disturb what should have been left alone. When that happened, he would not be there to stop them. He would be elsewhere, promoted or retired or dead, and the responsibility would fall to some other officer who would dismiss the warnings as superstition and proceed according to doctrine. And the witch would take what she was offered, as she always had, and the boundary would open again. The mountain did not forget. And neither Abbott knew, would he? General Pollock's column arrived at Abbott's position on the morning of March 20th, precisely as scheduled. The force moved with disciplined efficiency, infantry in the center, artillery and supply wagons, protected by cavalry screens on the flanks. Pollock himself rode near the head of the column, a compact man in his late 50s whose reputation for thoroughness had been earned through 3 decades of frontier service. He reviewed Abbott's reconnaissance report in his tent that evening, asked several detailed questions about terrain features and water sources, and expressed satisfaction with the intelligence provided. He made no inquiry about the casualties beyond noting them in his campaign log, and he did not ask why 5 men had been lost to tribal ambush in an area where no significant tribal presence had been detected by any other reconnaissance element. Abbott had prepared answers to those questions, but they were not needed. Pollock was a practical commander who understood that casualties occurred and that dwelling on them accomplished nothing. The reconnaissance was complete, the route was assessed as passable, and the column would proceed on schedule. On March 22nd, the main force transited the section of the pass adjacent to Khyber. Abbott had posted observation teams on the northern ridge as planned, maintaining visibility over the approach routes without requiring access to the summit. The mountain was visible throughout the day's march, its distinctive pyramidal peak rising above the surrounding heights, and several officers commented on the ruins that could be glimpsed near the top. Abbott deflected questions about them, saying they appeared to be ancient structures of unknown origin and limited tactical value. No one pressed for elaboration. The column moved through without incident. No tribal resistance materialized, no ambushes disrupted the march, and by evening they had cleared the danger area and established camp in more open terrain to the east. Pollock commended Abbott for his reconnaissance work and assigned him to the advance guard for the remainder of the march to Jalalabad. The campaign proceeded according to plan, and within 2 weeks, the British had relieved the garrison, secured the prisoners, and begun the process of punitive operations against the tribes who had participated in the destruction of the Kabul garrison. Abbott participated in those operations with competence and without distinction. He led patrols, supervised artillery placements, and conducted liaison with allied tribal chiefs who had remained neutral or sided with the British. He received a brevet promotion to major in recognition of his service and was mentioned favorably in several dispatches. His career continued its upward trajectory, and by August, he had been reassigned to a staff position in Peshawar, coordinating intelligence operations across the frontier. But the mountain remained with him. He dreamed of it frequently, always the same sequence: climbing the southern approach, entering the plaza, seeing the fissure open and the light pouring out. In the dreams, Yusuf did not arrive. The old guide remained absent, and Abbott stood alone before the witch while his men were taken one by one, hollowed out and discarded like empty shells. He would wake in his quarters drenched in sweat, his heart racing, and he would sit in the darkness until dawn, unwilling to return to sleep and risk the dream's resumption. He tried to investigate what had happened, using his position in intelligence to access regional records and tribal histories. He found references to Khyber scattered through archival documents dating back to the 18th century. A British surveyor in 1809 had noted the ruins and recommended they be studied by the Archaeological Survey, but the recommendation had been filed and forgotten. A missionary in 1823 had attempted to climb the mountain and establish a prayer station, but had abandoned the effort after his porters refused to ascend beyond the halfway point, citing local beliefs about the summit being cursed or inhabited by malign spirits. The most detailed account came from a memoir written by a Sikh commander who had campaigned in the region in 1776. He described the mountain as a place of doors, where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits was thin enough to cross, He wrote that the local tribes maintained a practice of sending a fakir, a holy man, into the ruins once every generation to perform a ritual that sealed the doors and prevented the spirits from emerging. The ritual required the fakir to enter the boundary willingly, offering his life to maintain the seal. Those who performed the duty were honored in tribal memory, their names preserved in oral tradition as guardians and protectors. Abbott wondered if Yusuf's name would be remembered that way, if the tribes would know what he had done and why. He doubted it. The old man had been working as a guide for the British, a collaborator in the eyes of many Pathans, and his sacrifice had been witnessed only by foreigners who would not speak of it. More likely, Yusuf would simply disappear from memory, another casualty of the war, his contribution unrecognized and his death unrecorded except as a line in Abbott's falsified report. The thought troubled Abbott more than he expected. He had made the pragmatic choice, the choice that protected his career and his men, but pragmatism came with a cost, and that cost was paid in truth. Yusuf deserved better than to be erased, but Abbott had erased him anyway, and there was no way to undo that decision without destroying everything he had built. In June, Abbott received word that Sergeant Wickham had died of fever in Jalalabad. The report noted no unusual circumstances, simply that he had contracted an illness common to the region and failed to recover. Abbott attended the burial and delivered a brief commendation, noting the sergeant's long service and steady character. He did not mention Khoi Jadu, and neither did any of the other men who had been present on the summit. They stood in silence while Wickham was interred, and then they dispersed to their duties, carrying the knowledge with them like a stone. Private Pierce recovered fully and was returned to active duty. He showed no lasting effects from the head injury, and no memory of the events on the summit beyond fragmentary impressions of light and sound. He was killed 3 months later during a skirmish with Ghilzai tribesmen shot through the throat while on picket duty. Abbott learned of his death through routine casualty reports and felt nothing except a distant sense of inevitability, as if the mountain had marked them all and was simply collecting its due at intervals. Havildar Ram Singh was evacuated to Peshawar for treatment of his broken arm. The bone healed poorly, leaving him with limited range of motion, and he was medically discharged from service in August. Abbott arranged for a modest pension and a letter of commendation, the least he could do for a man who had tried to warn him and had paid for that warning with his career. Ram Singh accepted both without comment and returned to his village in the Punjab. Abbott never saw him again. By September, the campaign was concluding. British forces withdrew from Afghanistan in a deliberate, organized manner, bringing out the garrison and the prisoners and leaving Shah Shuja to his fate. The king would be assassinated within months, and Afghanistan would return to the chaos of competing warlords and tribal confederations. The British would not return in force for another generation, and when they did, they would find the frontier unchanged, hostile, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to imperial ambition. Abbott was reassigned to a posting in Lahore, far from the passes and the mountains, and he accepted the transfer with relief. He wanted distance from Khoi Jadu, from the memory of what had happened there, and from the dreams that continued to disturb his sleep. He packed his belongings, submitted his final reports, and departed Peshawar on September 15th without looking back. But as his carriage rolled south toward the Punjab plains, he passed near the mouth of the Khyber Pass, and for a moment he saw the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks white with early snow. Somewhere among them was Khoi Jadu, the ruins on its summit dark and silent, the boundary sealed by Yusuf's sacrifice. Abbott wondered how long that seal would last, how many years or decades before someone else climbed the mountain and disturbed what lay beneath. He wondered, but he did not investigate. He had done his duty, paid his price, and earned his survival. What happened next was someone else's problem, someone else's nightmare. He turned his attention forward, toward his new posting and the routines of staff work that would occupy his days and distract him from the nights. The mountain would wait. The witch would watch. and the boundary would remain closed until the next generation found reason to open it. Abbott hoped that generation would not be his, but he suspected, as he had suspected on the night after the descent, that hope was insufficient protection against inevitability. The journal was discovered during the cataloging of materials donated to the museum by the estate of Major General James Abbott, who had died in 1896 at the age of 87. Abbott had enjoyed a distinguished career following his service in Afghanistan, rising through the ranks to command a division during the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and serving as military advisor to several frontier administrations before his retirement in 1873. His official papers had been deposited with the India office, but his personal effects, including several boxes of private correspondence and journals, had remained with his family until his last surviving son arranged for their donation. The archivist who opened the sealed leather journal was a young man named David Wickham, grandson of Sergeant Thomas Wickham, who had died in Jalalabad in 1842. The coincidence of names was not immediately apparent. Wickham was a common surname, and the archivist had no detailed knowledge of his grandfather's service record beyond the basic facts. Enlisted 1830, served in India and Afghanistan, died of fever 1842. But as he read Abbott's journal entries from March 1842, the connection became impossible to ignore. The journal was not a daily log, but a sporadic record, entries written at irregular intervals over a period of 50 years. The entries from March 1842 were dated weeks after the events they described, written in Abbott's quarters in Peshawar during sleepless nights when the dreams had become too insistent to ignore. He had documented everything: the reconnaissance mission, the first descent, the return of the 7 survivors, Wickham's account of the fissure and the hollow arm, the decision to return with explosives, and finally Yusuf's sacrifice and the sealing of the boundary. The account was detailed, precise, and utterly at odds with the official reconnaissance report that sat in the India office archives. Abbott had noted the discrepancy himself, writing in a later entry dated 1845. I justified the falsification as necessary to preserve operational security and protect the men from accusations of cowardice or insanity. But the truth is simpler. I was afraid. Afraid of ridicule, afraid of the damage to my career, afraid that speaking honestly about what we encountered would mark me as unfit for command. I chose reputation over truth, and 5 men are recorded as killed by tribal ambush, when in fact they were taken by something far older and far less comprehensible. Yusuf gave his life to seal a boundary that should never have been disturbed, and I repaid that sacrifice by erasing him from the official record. This journal is the only honest account that will survive, and I have instructed that it remain sealed until after my death. Let those who read it judge whether I was right to choose silence. David Wickham read the entire journal in a single sitting, working through the evening and into the night in the museum's archive room. He found subsequent entries scattered across the decades, Abbott returning periodically to the subject of Ko-e-Jadoo as if unable to leave it behind. In 1858, Abbott had written about hearing reports of strange phenomena in the Khyber Pass, accounts from British troops and tribal sources describing lights on the mountain, and sounds like breathing that emanated from the summit during winter months. He had not investigated, had not reported the accounts to higher authority, but he had noted them in his journal with the comment, "The seal holds, but it weakens. How long before it fails entirely?" In 1878, during the Second Afghan War, Abbott had written a lengthy entry documenting his attempt to warn the commanding general about Ko-e-Jadoo. He had requested that reconnaissance parties avoid the mountain and that no observation posts be established on the summit. The request had been denied as tactically unsound, and Abbott had been politely but firmly told that operational decisions would not be influenced by local superstition or personal concerns. He wrote, "I tried. I failed. What happens now is not my responsibility, but I will carry the guilt regardless. Wickham found a newspaper clipping tucked into the journal between pages dated December 1878. It was from the Civil and Military Gazette, published in Lahore, reporting that a British reconnaissance party operating in the Khyber Pass had disappeared without trace near a location identified only as a mountain of disputed name known to locals as the Place of Doors. Search parties had found no bodies, no equipment, no indication of what had occurred. The incident was attributed to tribal action, and the case was closed. Abbott had written in the margin, 12 men, the same number I sent in 1842. The boundary demands its due, and we continue to pay it in ignorance. The final entry related to Khyber was dated 1893, 3 years before Abbott's death. His handwriting was shakier, the text harder to read, but the content was clear. He had received a letter from a former colleague still serving on the frontier, describing increased tribal activity near the Khyber Pass and strange reports from villages on the approaches to an unnamed mountain. The tribesmen were performing rituals, the letter said, sending holy men into the heights to conduct ceremonies that their elders claimed were necessary to maintain balance and prevent catastrophe. The British administration had dismissed the rituals as primitive superstition and was considering prohibiting them as contrary to public order. Abbott's response was anguished. They are doing what we failed to do. They remember what we have forgotten, or what we never learned. The boundary must be maintained. The seal must be renewed. And they have preserved the knowledge of how. If we stop them, if we prohibit the rituals in the name of progress and enlightenment, we will open a door that cannot be closed by force of arms or weight of numbers. I have written to the Governor General's office, recommending that the tribal practices be permitted to continue without interference. I doubt my letter will be read, and I know it will not be heeded. I am an old man whose warnings have never been believed. Why should this time be different? Wickham closed the journal and sat in the silent archive room, trying to process what he had read. His grandfather had been there, had witnessed what Abbott described, and had died 6 months later without speaking of it to anyone. Had Thomas Wickham carried the memory with him, haunted by what he had seen? Had he tried to forget, or had he simply accepted that some experiences existed beyond the possibility of communication? The archivist made notes on the journal's contents, cataloging it as a personal memoir with historical value related to the First Afghan War. He noted the discrepancies with the official record, but attributed them to the subjective nature of personal recollection and the psychological effects of combat stress. He recommended the journal be made available to researchers studying the period, but he flagged certain sections as potentially unreliable due to their fantastic content. He did not suppress the journal, but he effectively marginalized it. When researchers consulted Abbott's papers in subsequent years, they focused on his official reports and his documented achievements, ignoring or dismissing the journal entries that described impossible events and supernatural phenomena. The journal became a curiosity, an example of how even respected officers could succumb to superstition when exposed to the pressures of frontier warfare. In 1947, when India gained independence and the British withdrew from the subcontinent, the Khyber Pass reverted to tribal control. The Pakistani government established limited authority over the region, but the tribes maintained their traditional practices, including the rituals associated with certain sacred sites. Khyber was one such site, though its significance was known only to the elders and those initiated into the deeper traditions. Every generation, according to accounts recorded by Pakistani anthropologists in the 1960s, a volunteer would be selected from among the tribes to ascend the mountain and perform a ceremony that maintained the seal on what the elders called the threshold of the forgotten ones. The volunteer was always a fakir, a man who had renounced worldly concerns and devoted himself to spiritual practice. He would climb alone, enter the ruins, and complete the ritual. He would not return. The tribe would mark his passage with prayers and remember his name, adding it to the long list of guardians who had given themselves to preserve the boundary. The anthropologists noted the practice but did not witness it. They were told that foreigners were not permitted to observe the ceremony, and that any attempt to do so would be met with violence. The researchers respected the prohibition and documented the tradition without direct observation. In their published report, they described it as an example of pre-Islamic religious practice that had survived centuries of cultural change, a testament to the durability of oral tradition in isolated communities. They did not speculate on whether the tradition served any practical purpose beyond cultural continuity. They did not ask what, if anything, was actually sealed within the mountain. And they did not connect the tribal practice to the disappearances of British reconnaissance parties in 1842 and 1878 because those incidents existed in different archives under different classifications, and the researchers had no reason to look for patterns across unrelated data sets. In 2001, during the American invasion of Afghanistan, Special Operations Forces operating in the Khyber Pass region were briefed on local cultural sensitivities and instructed to avoid certain sites deemed sacred by the tribes. One such site was identified on military maps as Hill 4487, a pyramidal peak on the southern wall of the pass, with ruins visible on the summit. The briefing noted that the site was protected by local agreement and that any military activity in the immediate vicinity would likely trigger tribal resistance. Commanders were advised to route patrols and supply convoys around the area unless operational necessity dictated otherwise. No American forces visited the summit. The ruins remained undisturbed, and in the villages at the base of the mountain, the elders continued to select volunteers from among the fakirs, men who understood what was required and were willing to pay the price. The tradition continued as it had for centuries, maintained not by written doctrine or institutional memory, but by the simpler mechanism of lived experience. Those who forgot what the mountain contained learned the lesson again, and those who remembered ensured the knowledge was passed on. In 2018, a researcher at the British Library discovered Abbott's journal while conducting unrelated research on frontier military operations. She read the March 1842 entries with interest and attempted to cross-reference them with official reconnaissance reports from the period. The discrepancies were obvious, but she attributed them to the common practice of sanitizing reports to protect operational security or command reputation. She noted the journal in a footnote of her dissertation, but did not investigate further. The mountain remains. The ruins remain. And whether by tribal ritual or by some property of the boundary itself, the seal remains closed. The witch waits, patient and indifferent, guardian of a threshold that predates empires and will outlast them. She has seen the Mughals come and go, the British rise and retreat, and the Americans arrive and depart. She will see whatever comes next. The boundary does not care who crosses it, who seals it, or who remembers. It simply is a permanent feature of the landscape, a door that can be opened but never destroyed. In every generation, someone must pay the price to keep it closed. The tribes understand this. They remember what others have forgotten. And when the memory fails, when the rituals are abandoned or prohibited or simply lost to time, the boundary will open again. The witch will emerge. And those who disturb what should have been left alone will learn what Captain James Abbott learned in March of 1842, that some debts must be paid in full and that the mountain never forgets.